This is City Hall for Culver City, which is a community in the Los Angeles area. Those who are elected to serve in this building, as well as those who are employed in this building, are expected to work on behalf of the greatest good of the constituency that resides within Culver City, California. And they are expected to do so in a nonpartisan way. That is, not letting these particular party politics influence policy decisions. But is there such thing as nonpartisanship even when there's no party involved? Is there something else that is underlying politics and decisions that are made in this building? Well, our reading this week from Charles Mills seems to suggest so. Let's talk about it. All right, hello everyone, and welcome to today's lecture where we will be going over the first 7 pages of The Racial Contract by Charles Mills. So let's go ahead and dive in. So as we started at City Hall for Culver City, this is not just something that is limited to Culver City. Obviously, this applies to any municipality, state, and or federal level. Taking a look at what really informs and undergirds law, statutes, different things of that sort. This is exactly where Charles Mills' work is going to pick up on and start asking some questions. So let's go ahead and move forward. What's going to be our roadmap for today in terms of what we're going to be looking at? First, we're going to start with a flashback by looking at key things from the previous lecture that need to be carried over to this lecture so that you can understand it in context better. Then we're going to take a look at Mills's intervention. We're going to take a look at understanding the social contract, the Declaration of Independence, the racial contract, and then, of course, what is white supremacy, right? Because Charles Mills allows us to have a nuanced understanding of white supremacy and what it is and what it does. So let's go ahead and begin with a flashback from our previous lecture where we talked about a number of things as it relates to critical race theory and its origins, in terms of its intellectual origins and what is considered to be within the academy, but more specifically, its social context and its social movement context, right? So key in that lecture was literally the words critical race theory. And we broke that word down, and where we can see Charles Mills' work fitting in specifically is looking at that fourth point in critical as challenging the assumptions and exclusions of the prevailing conceptual, theoretical, or analytical framework of a discourse and or discipline. This is important in Charles Mills' work because he is a what? Philosopher. And he is saying that, hey, I am looking at the conversation that is taking place in social contract theory that is a Western political theory. We'll talk more about that in just a bit. And I'm noticing that there are some opportunities in terms of analyzing and understanding society within that discourse, within that conversation. So he's going to challenge the assumptions and the exclusions of what is taking place there. And he's certainly looking at race as something that has a socio-political value that is doing something, and he's certainly operating within theory, as we can see. And as it relates to critical race theory in terms of an academic descriptive and what it does, remember, he is a philosopher. And again, this is another reason why CRT is not taught at the K through 12 level, because you do have to have knowledge of these different areas. You need sociology, you need history, you need political science, you need philosophy, you need anthropology, and then you bring all of that over to once you begin learning about law, right? So with that being stated and given that background, let's go ahead and move forward. Who is Charles Mills? Let's start there. First of all, he is of West Indian descent. He is born in London. He's raised in Jamaica, and he eventually obtains United States citizenship. And the reason why this is important is because Charles Mills is theorizing from a lived experience. Right? He's not theorizing the contract from what he hopes will be. He's theorizing the racial contract from what is. Who does this sound like? Derek Bell. So notice that those who are writing, who are researching in CRT, once again, are theorizing and are doing social movement work from what is, not what they hope to be. And that is one of the most distinguishing parts about CRT, that it's not this thing about like, this is how the state should operate. CRT is saying this is how the state operates, and here's some things that we should consider. So along those lines, what he is doing is he is making an intervention in Western world philosophy. And what we mean by intervention within academic spaces is this is his contribution. This is a way of him disrupting the discourse, the conversation, and this is his academic legacy in terms of what it is the work that he will be working on and what he will be doing, throughout his career, right? So what he's doing is he's making an intervention in Western world philosophy. That means he is taking a look at all of the things that inform the development of Western societies. Western societies would be United States, UK, etc., right? And he's critiquing those philosophies and specifically social contract theory. And more directly, what he's doing is he is looking at discourse that is provided in academic canonical texts and standard textbooks. In other words, those texts that are required for you to get a degree, he's looking at those texts and he's saying, wait a minute now, there's something that is short, that is missing, that is not there when it comes to these texts that we need to be talking about. And because there is a blind spot in these texts, the graduates that we are turning out is missing this particular information. From there, again, what he is doing to fill in that gap, he is producing a philosophy of lived realities rather than abstract conceptual theories. Now, why does this matter? Because this places him in conversation with people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Thomas Hobbes, and John Locke, who are key theorists of the social contract theory. Now, he's going to differentiate himself from this particular social contract theory that is born of a desired political outcome during the European Enlightenment. So what is it that these particular men are saying that that Mills wants to challenge, right? So let's take a look at them really quickly so that we can understand the context of the argument and where Charles Mills's intervention is coming in. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau is born in 1712 and he passes away in 1778, right? That means that he is alive during the time of slavery. Slavery is informing his worldview, right? As well as what he feels that he is entitled to, what rights should be, and what rights should not be. Key for all three of these guys, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Thomas Hobbes, as well as John Locke, is moving people from what political theorists call the state of nature into the social contract that civilizes them. Right? So when we say state of nature in political theory, that refers to the social location of folks before there is a government, without order, etc. And each one of these guys has a various approach and aspect of view about what the state of nature is and what the social contract is supposed to do, right? So along those lines, Jean-Jacques Rousseau believes that the state of nature is primitive yet balanced. Now keep in mind what I said about his worldview and what is being experienced right now within the 1700s. So you have slavery, you have the emergence and development of capitalism that is being made possible by way of slavery, right? So we're talking about a type of racial capitalism, and what this lets us know is that capitalism has always been racialized since its origins, right? A book that you can read more about this on is Black Marxism, right? Please check that text out. It's by Cedric Robinson. It is a thick text, but it is worth it. And what Jean-Jacques Rousseau is interested in, particularly that is able to happen through the social contract, is that the common interests of society be attended to. Now, the question you have to ask is, who is society and what becomes the common interest of society? That means sustaining the economic viability of society, securing those resources. And how are those resources being secured during this time? Slavery. Do you see what's informing the lens here? So when Jean-Jacques Rousseau is talking about making sure that the common interest of society is provided for, he can be, his particular approach to the social contract theory, which we'll talk more about, can be seen as supporting democracy and totalitarianism, excuse me. So he also believes that society should participate in democratic processes. Again, you should be asking yourself, who does he mean by society, and how does that society participate in democratic processes? Implicated here are women. Implicated here are those who are being enslaved. Implicated here are those who are experiencing the superimposition of colonial powers within their land. Right? There's something very specific taking place here. So when he says that society should participate in democratic processes, there are already people who are included as well as excluded. This is why Charles Mills, going back to this fourth point of critical and critical race theory, is challenging the assumptions and exclusions of the prevailing conceptual and theoretical and analytical framework of a given discourse. This is why it's important. Let's move on to Thomas Hobbes and why Mills would be challenging Thomas Hobbes. So again, Thomas Hobbes is born in 1588 and he passes away in 1679. Again, what's going on the world stage during this time? Okay? Slavery doesn't begin at the point of 1619. Spanish colonies were already involved in slavery during that particular time. And what Thomas Hobbes believes is that there should be an absolute sovereign because the state of nature is always in conflict before the social contract. And he believes in authoritarianism. He believes in authoritarianism, that there should be an absolute power, that everyone should be submitted to the state, both those that are in upper class, middle class, lower class, etc. Right? That is what he is doing. But remember what his worldview is, and that if slavery is taking place on the world scene at this time, and it is, right, that in order to secure those processes and the well-being of society, Thomas Hobbes says you need an absolute sovereign for that to take place. Now, what philosophers will do is they will get into the weeds of these arguments of the various social contract theories that I'm talking about right now, with three of them. But Mills is saying, I'm not even going down that road. We first have to talk about who is excluded and who is included, right? And then there is John Locke, who is born in 1632 to 1704, and he's saying that the state of nature is peace, that everybody is at peace before the social contract theory kicks in. And he says that humans are inherently free, equal, and independent. Now that sounds good, and like we want to get on board with brother John Locke, but there are some issues here because John Locke owned stock in a company that was participating in the slave trade. He was also the secretary of the Lords of Proprietors of the Carolinas, where enslavement was permitted by what? Law. And what do CRT theorists do? They critique what? Law. So we have to be aware of these things and aware of these moves so that when these theories such as social contract theory were laid out during the European Enlightenment, right, which we'll critique in just a bit, they already excluded certain peoples and did not have those peoples in mind as Western nations were being developed. The United States Declaration of Independence takes place in 1776. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is the only one who is around, right, because he passes away in 1778, when that takes place. That means how Jean-Jacques Rousseau is thinking about the nation state, who's included, who's not included, as well as Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Their work just doesn't disappear. It's taken into consideration as the United States is being developed, right? But John Locke is going to focus on individual rights and limited government, as well as democracy. His particular approach can be seen as supporting democracy. But the thing to understand here is that those individual rights and limited government only applies to certain people. This is where Charles Mills' work is making its intervention. He's saying that these particular people and many others, because he lists them in the beginning of this book, right, did not have certain demographics in mind when they wrote out these theories, that the theories was always in service of those who were seen to be an active part of the nation state. And what John Locke work makes clear, by the way, is that like race, gender, and money, rights are what? A social construction. Rights do not inherently exist, that they have to be bought into being by the nation state. Okay, so as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Thomas Hobbes, and all of these different folks are theorizing the social contract, they're theorizing it within the time frame of the European Enlightenment. Now, the European Enlightenment is from about 1685 to 1815. Now, when we think about the Enlightenment era, excuse me, when we think about the Enlightenment era, for some reason, we think that means the world came into enlightenment. No, the rest of the world was already enlightened. People were already circumnavigating the globe, right? This is why important texts like They Came Before Columbus by Ivan Van Sertima is important, right? Trading routes were already established. Universities and societies were already established. One of them we can think about is the University of Timbuktu that had been around at least since the 12th century. So who is in need of enlightenment here? In other words, what is very, very clear is that Europe is late to world history. And that because Europe is late to world history, when the social contract is thought out, it necessarily excludes those who necessarily has to be oppressed, because Europe needs to advance with the rest of the world about this time, because gold is already on the scene, silk is already on the scene, trading food goods is already on the scene. These things are already going on. But Europe is not involved in this. They have to go through an enlightenment period. But enlightenment for who? And toward what end? And this is where Charles Mills's work makes its intervention, that the development of Western society, the colonialization of lands, was always already a racialized project. That is what Charles Mills is getting at when he is critiquing the social contract. So then that brings up the question of what is the social contract exactly? If people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Thomas Hobbes, and John Locke is going to say when one moves from the state of nature to the social contract and they come under a centralized government, that they become civilized, then what is it in the social contract, right, that makes them civilized? Now, this is just going to be a quick overview, right, for those of you all who may not be familiar with the social contract, or it's been a while since you've dealt with social contract theory, right? So first of all, social contract theory is a Western political theory that really informs how Western nations develop, right? It is agreement among individuals within a given social context. And what they agree upon is laws, statutes, regulations that everyone will live by, or as we call it, consent of the governed. Consent of the governed. Now, within that, what you have to ask is, who are the governed? Who counts as the governed? Right? And again, what this does is the social contract is it transitions individuals from a state of nature to a civilized state under a centralized government. But the question you have to ask yourself is, wait a minute, this is taking place during the Enlightenment era. So who is in a state of nature versus who is civilized? Because the rest of the world already had social formations, economic formations, political formations. So who was in a state of nature that needed to be civilized? Was it the rest of the world? Was it Europe? These are things to think about. So the social contract in and of itself is a technology of colonialism that brings into being democratic projects that are shaped and informed by the social contract, which in turn in itself is shaped and informed by who is included and who is excluded. Because when a contract is informed, think about your car loan, your mortgage, etc. I can't call to your provider and get information. Why? Because it's a contract between you and the lender or whatever the case may be. So the contract necessarily excludes as it includes, and we've got to ask some questions about who is included and who is excluded, and is that contract able to be negotiated over time, expanded, or contracted. And so toward that end, there are some questions that come up, and questions that should be considered is, number one, who establishes this social contract? Who establishes it? And then who is included and excluded within that contract? And then how does the contract become perpetuated? Think about this. When people say, do you know who I am? Or parents of parents of parents of parents of parents from generations long ago that were invested in slavery, right, have been able to pass that wealth down over time. How does the contract become perpetuated? These are things to think about. What this lets us know is that the contract has moved from a type of abstract theorized idea about the self and what the self is entitled to that it has become something concrete, something tangible, something real, whereby values, assets, and social entitlement is transferred from generation to generation. But who is the demographic that is privileged from generation to generation within Western society formations that is able to access and take advantage of the social contract and is favorably positioned by the contract? And along those lines, what we then have to ask is, what takes place when there is a disagreement about the contract, particularly by those who are subjected to it, but did not agree to it and have no interest in it and are not favorably positioned by the contract, but are nonetheless impacted by it? This is where Black folk, people of color, women, queer folk, etc. come into play. Because what you now have to think about is, okay, I'm born into a society, but did I agree to the rules of this society, the construction of this society, and how this works out? How do you come to agree to the terms of society? This is what Charles Mills is getting at, and this is why his work is so powerful, because it forces you to rethink the social construction of society, and why rules are the way they are, and how did you come to acquiesce to those rules. And when you begin to think about that, you begin to think about how society is imbalanced, and how certain groups not being equal to other groups is seen as balanced or fair within the social contract. In other words, the imbalance and inequities that are inherently built into the social contract allows for an understanding that society is operating as intended, that it is a social contract and society is operating as intended. So what is an example of a social contract that we can look at and have a very real example of? Let's talk about the Declaration of Independence. Now, some things to keep in mind here is that the Declaration of Independence takes place in 1776. We all know this, right? July 4th. Alive at this time is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. His work is informing how a nation state is formed. But also Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, their work just doesn't go away. Each philosopher is building upon the work of another. And so the social contract theory work of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and others are informing how the founding fathers, if that's what we would like to call them, right, is conceptualizing and understanding the United States. And they understand the social contract to include and exclude at this particular point in time. right? Because what is going on? Again, slavery is on the world stage. And in order to establish a nation, what do you need? An economy. And they're not going to get out there and do the work that those who are enslaved are doing. So slavery is used as a means to establish the foundations and the structural enforcements of the United States. This is important so that those who are establishing the United States understand who they are in relation to the subjugation of another people. Without the subjugation of those people, then those who are establishing the nation state have no clue who they are. In other words, the social contract is being used as a technology of colonialism to define the being by subjugating and excluding persons from the contract. Whether that be native and indigenous folk, whether that be those who resided on continental Africa and were enslaved, right? Whether that be indentured servants who were coming over from Europe with the classed persons from Great Britain, right? Because the classed persons of Great Britain, their overall concern was, you're treating us like common folk and we have money, so we should be able to do what you are doing. We do not have to subject ourselves to a sovereign. So their interest wasn't necessarily doing away with government. They wanted a different type of representative government that would allow them to have the same power as the absolute sovereign across the sea. You see the move that's being made here? So with that understanding of what the social contract is doing, now let's take a look at this, and then we're going to move into what Mills is doing with the racial contract, and then we will wrap up. So let's go through this. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. Stop right there first in the unanimous declaration. That means that there are certain people at the table who have agreed to this decision as a whole. Are women at the table? Are people of color at the table? Are indigenous and native people at the table? Are black folk at the table? Who are the unanimous folks that are establishing the declaration here, right? This lets us know the first sentence in that the contract is including and excluding right away at the foundations of the nations. This is why Mills is doing this work, because he's going back and forcing us to rethink the constructions of society and why we are experiencing what we are experiencing. Let's move forward. So the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America, when in the course of human events, there's that human word. Think about John Locke and who he interpreted as being human, while keeping in mind that he owned stock in a company that participated in the slave trade, and that he also served as the Lord of Proprietors of the Carolinas, where, again, enslavement was permitted by law. So when in the course of human events, human in this instance becomes a qualifier in order to be a part of this particular social contract. So who is considered human and who is not, right? This becomes particularly important when we look later on down the line, and those who are enslaved are considered what? 3/4 of a person, and therefore not fully what? Human. Catch it, right? So when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people. Who are the one people? Pay attention to these words. To dissolve the political bands which have connected them with one another. Obviously, they're talking about Great Britain here. And to assume among the powers of the earth. Who are the powers of the earth? The developing Western nations. The separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. There it is again. Laws of nature, state of nature, nature's God entitles them. They're understanding themselves in relation to a subjugated population. And they're saying, well, we are entitled to this because our social contract over here says we deserve this, but you're not allowing us access to it. But we do and are entitled to this rather. And therefore we're going to oppress over here and establish this nation. Right? You all have to follow the document along, right? So after they say that, they say the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. In other words, this opening paragraph here is them saying, we're about to lay out why we're leaving this nation, and we're going to do the same thing in another nation. Here's some insight. They're not critiquing power. They're critiquing that they don't have access to that power, and that they want to do that same power in a different location. Right? This is the whole taxation without representation. All that falls up under entitlement, because they see themselves as being entitled to representation, because they understand the social contract to apply to themselves, because they have moved from the laws or state of nature over into a social contract, and they want the same thing. One has to be careful about desiring the same power and keeping the constructs, right? But the outcome is not going to change. So what does this mean? When we say things like we want equality, equality with what? Equality with who? And what does it mean to have equality within a nation state that is inherently oppressive and marginalizing? We have to think through those things, right? Let's move on. So they say, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Again, who is the we here that's saying it's self-evident? And how does it come to be self-evident? The social contract that was already established. Do you all see the moves that are going on here? Who's included, who's excluded, how they're understanding themselves? So they say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Right? Think about the qualifiers of men. Think about what we discussed earlier about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Thomas Hobbes, and John Locke. That they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That the social contract guarantees them unalienable rights, and that among them are life, liberty, and happiness. And to the extent that these things aren't happening for them, then they have a right to go make it happen elsewhere. In other words, they understand that the nation state should be in service to them. And to the extent that the nation state is not in service to them, then there is a problem. How do we know this? Let's move to the next sentence. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Stop. There's a social contract. The contract comes into being by instituting governments among men, because they are coming together and they are agreeing on laws, statutes, policies, the arrangement of society. In other words, the entirety of society is a social construction that comes into being by way of agreeing on certain principles, how things will be done. But again, the question you have to ask yourself is, do you agree to that particular composition of society? What does this mean? It means that we are inherently living in someone's political imagination. And that what CRT is saying, that it's time to reimagine what we can make possible in the world. That the social contract is a political imagination, but that we can absolutely do something different here, right? So that to secure these rights among men, that secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the who? The governed. Who were the governed during this era? Let's think about this. That whenever any form of government, pay attention to this next move, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, what ends? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, right? That certain entitlement rights, keeping in mind that rights are socially constructed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government. Who are the people? Keep it in mind that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, what could be seen as destructive? Affirmative action, DEI. Do you all see the moves that are being made here? These particular different social issues that are taking place are seen as infringing upon the entitlements of the social contract. Therefore, when government takes that form and becomes destructive of the ends of life, liberty, pursuit, and happiness, it is the right of the people who agreed to the social contract to alter or abolish the government. Could that be what we are seeing and experiencing in real time? These are things to think about and through, right? Let's move on. And to institute new government. What does new government look like? One might think about Project 2025 as instituting new government or reinstituting government in a particular and specific ways, right? By all of the policies that are being laid out, by the way that executive orders are being rolled out. Think about this. The social contract is not just some political theory. It is something that is tangible and real and happening in real time. So it says, and to institute new government, lay its foundation on what? Such principles in organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their what? Safety and happiness. That the new government must lay its foundations on such principles in organizing. What principles in organizing? The terms of the original social contract. And toward that end, its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to do what? Affect their safety and their happiness. In other words, to bring it about. So therefore, we start abolishing and doing away with certain programs because it is about their safety and happiness. Do you see the moves that it's making here and why Charles Mills' work is important? It is a straight out critique. So along those lines, what Charles Mills rolls out is the racial contract. And how is he defining the racial contract, or how might we think about it? Right? The racial contract can then be thought of as a tacit socio-political arrangement which serves as the supporting substructure upon which the social contract itself is established. In other words, what Charles Mills is saying is that the racial contract, what he's saying in the book that we've read, is he's saying that the racial contract becomes the underwriting of, or is the underwriter of, the social contract itself. It's what informs the social contract. So just like we started this lecture at a city hall and saying that, you know, those who are employed here, those who are elected here are supposed to make nonpartisan decisions. What Charles Mills is going to say is that even though these decisions are seen as nonpartisan, there is a underwriting contract underneath those decisions, whether it be in your municipality, your state, your country, right, wherever you may be. He's saying that there is a racial contract that serves as an underwriting mechanism to those decisions that is not acknowledged at the surface level. And that because of that underwriting contract that helps to fund and inform the social contract itself, whereby decisions are made about who gets what, when, where, how, and why, it permits the treatment and social positioning of those who are subjected to inequality and marginalization. This will be racialized persons, women, queer folk, right? That it allows those folks who are subjected to inequality and marginalization in society to be interpreted as being equal to those who are favorably positioned by the social contract. So mistreatment of a group of people is seen as equal to the favorable treatment of another within the context of the social contract because the racial contract exists. In other words, understanding the racial contract has implications for both white folk, people of color, indigenous and native people, black folk, queer folk, right? This is why it's important to understand the social contract. So if it's not quite clicking all the way just now, think about it in this way. Right? In terms of using an app on your phone or device. When you are engaging with the app itself, you are a user. So we can think about voting as a way of being a user, of interacting with the app. Who is the app? The government, right? And how is that government made possible? By way of the social contract, which is an operating system. And how is the operating system made possible? By way of the racial contract, which is the hardware. So when we vote and there are certain outcomes, and seemingly no matter how we vote, we always get the same outcome. It's not the application that hasn't been updated. It's not even the operating system that's malfunctioning. Rather, the app, which is providing an experience for the user, is operating as intended because the hardware, i.e. the racial contract, is operating according to its code. Y'all picking up what's being put down here? Right? So along those lines, what might we think of as another name for the racial contract? White supremacy. This is what Charles Mills is getting at. That white supremacy is a racialized socio-political arrangement of society that determines who gets what, when, where, how, and why. This is the ultimate argument of his work, and this is why I said when we started out reading this text that his first sentence in this book matters. When he says that white supremacy is the unnamed political system that has made the modern world what it is today. He is saying that white supremacy is the underwriting force of the social contract, right? And that from that derives, and that white supremacy derives from idealized theories of the self as well as understandings, entitlements, and rights of the self. In other words, a political imagination rather than lived reality, and manifests in various political nation state formations and articulations. That white supremacy is not necessarily someone calling you a racialized term, right, or derogatory term. That is what sociologists call a racialized act. But that white supremacy is actually a socio-political arrangement of society. It is a social formation. This is important. So when people are advocating for certain things to take place, they are talking about the arrangement of society, and that society should be arranged to privilege certain people and not others, because that is what is guaranteeing or underwriting the social contract. And they understand themselves, regardless of their class position, to be entitled to that contract and have hopes to get in on that contract. This is where working class white folk come in. This is why things like MAGA appeals to certain class persons, even if it appears to be to their detriment, because they understand themselves and hope to be included within that social contract one day, without understanding the fact, and this is where white supremacy also applies to white folks as well, that whiteness has qualifiers, such as class, such as gender, and in some instances, geography, right? It's not necessarily caught up with rule spaces. But the idea is that if I ascribe and I agree to, then I too will be entered in that. But for me being in this class position, I too would be included. This is where that comes in. And what Charles Mills' work says here, and we're wrapping it here, is that these different governmental formations, aristocracy, democracy, absolutism, liberalism, so on and so forth, all fall up under that umbrella. So while we are struggling with which governmental formation is best, Charles Mills is saying it doesn't matter because all of it falls up under the same umbrella. And that umbrella in turns is what is undergirding and informing political decisions, yet we do not see it as political. We do not see it as political. What that should now do is bring further light to this text in the moves that he is making and pointing out the racial contract and its importance to the social contract. Okay? So with that being stated, that is our lecture 2, and I will see you all for the next one. Peace.